My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the center, I'd like to welcome you to this special event today, special webinar, focusing on Israel's judicial overhaul, domestic and international implications. It's kind of a strange date today, by the way, if you haven't noticed. It's 3/23/23, or if you're in the Middle East, it's 23/3/23. Kind of a tongue twister. But we're very delighted to host this webinar today, and very delighted that so many people have joined us from here in the States, from the Middle East, from Europe. So welcome to all of you. We appreciate your participation in this program. By way of introduction, and before introducing our great panel, let me say a few remarks about the issue that we are discussing today. Over the past 3 months, or a little less, tens of thousands of Israelis have been protesting. As a matter of fact, at one point, it reached 500,000. Of course, for Israel, if you compare that with the United States, you're talking about the equivalent here in the States of about 18 million people crowding the streets of the United States, demonstrating against policy. But what they are essentially protesting is the contentious judicial overhaul plan proposed by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his ultra-right coalition government. A proposal that has clearly plunged the country into unprecedented domestic crisis, raising alarm also in the West, including actually among Jewish diasporas, which is also somewhat rare. The plan is being spearheaded by Minister of Justice in Israel, Yariv Levin, and Religious Zionism Party legislator Simcha Rothman, who consider the Israeli legal system to be too liberal somehow, or too secular, and thus heavily biased, or has been heavily biased against kind of the ruling radical right now, and its allies within the settler movement and the ultra-religious community that is part of the coalition these days. The proposed changes seek to weaken the Supreme Court by allowing a simple majority vote in the Knesset to override court rulings, denying the court the authority to review Israel's basic laws, essentially de facto constitution, granting politicians the power to appoint judges, and instituting other significant changes to the country's judiciary that Israel hasn't seen actually since its establishment in 1948. Although the Netanyahu government is presenting the overhaul as a reform measure meant to restore checks and balances, to use kind of American or Western concepts, between the branches of government in Israel, its legislative plan, if passed, would enact sweeping changes to the courts, weaken their independence, and limit personal freedoms, in addition to benefiting Netanyahu as he faces personally trial on corruption charges. The Arab Center, Washington, D.C. is convening this panel today, a panel of experts, to unpack these recent events in Israel and their implications, first for the country as a whole, two, for the non-Jewish or Palestinian citizens of Israel specifically, and also for Israeli relations with the global Jewish diaspora, which seem to be rocky these days, and for U.S.-Israel ties. Our panelists will explore the legal dimensions of the judicial overhaul and the future of Israeli democracy, in parentheses, in light of both the proposal and the occupation itself that remains intact, of course. And will analyze the potential impact of the Israeli government's policies and legislative proposals for the Palestinians in the occupied territories and for Palestinian citizens of Israel, as I said earlier. The discussion will also include an assessment of the implications for Israel's relations with its traditional Western allies, particularly the United States and the EU, or the European Union. In terms of the specific agenda, I will introduce the panelists at this point. We're very glad that we are joined by all 5 great experts on the situation in Israel from their different perspectives. We will begin with Khalil Karayanni, who is the Bruce Wayne Chair in International Law at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He will be helping us by covering the legal dimensions of this judicial overhaul being proposed and beginning to be implemented in Israel, and the impact particularly on the Palestinian citizens of Israel. After Mikhail, we will move to Omri Boehm, who is Associate Professor and Chair of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research. And he will be focusing essentially on what I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the judicial proposals in the context of Israeli democracy. A lot of debate has been taking place and a lot of writings on the subject, including excellent articles by, if you're interested beyond the discussion today, Omri has written some good pieces. Others have, even today, Mairav Zonszein has written a new piece on this, and I'm sure you will be interested in their writings on this. What is meant by Israel being a democracy? Is this doable? After that, Amira Hass will follow, who is, of course, a well-known correspondent for Haaretz in the occupied territories of the West Bank. And she will be helping us with the impact of this current Israeli government crisis and its proposed policies on the Palestinians, particularly in the occupied territories, and specifically also on settlements, on settler violence, which seems to be playing a very important role at this time in these unfolding events in Israel and Palestine. And then we will have a presentation by Mairav Zonszein, who's a senior analyst on Palestine and Israel and at the International Crisis Group, has written extensively on these topics. And she will be focusing her remarks on the US component of this crisis, addressing the impact on US-Israeli relations and specifically on the American Jewish community. Noga Tarnopolsky is not necessarily going to participate in the 10-minute presentations per se, but we will give her the opportunity to comment after the other four panelists proceed. And then we will dedicate the balance of our time, about 30 minutes. We hope to be finished by 11 our time. And we'll spend the last 30 minutes of the webinar on Q&A. If you would like to participate by sending your questions, please identify yourself. Use the Q&A button at the bottom of the page. I'll be more than glad to read your question and pass it on, directed to a specific panelist or to all panelists as you wish. And I'll be more than glad to pass your questions on and read them publicly. And what we will do now is we will begin with Khalil Karayanni, and each speaker will have 10 minutes. And I'll give you a warning during the 10th minute of your presentation or after 9 minutes. And then we will give everybody a chance to make some general remarks about the subtopics that I mentioned earlier. And again, if you would like to send your questions, use the Q&A button at the bottom of the page, or email us at email.arabcenterdc.org. Khalil, the microphone is yours. You have 10 minutes. Please proceed.
Thank you for having me. Actually, there are a lot of points of entry to the discussion about the Palestinian Arabs in Israel as a minority group. What I will be presenting is actually that they form a kind of a third camp in the current upheaval. They're obviously not with reform initiators, the government coalition, but neither are they with those in opposition to. And that's why they are absent. I wouldn't say almost completely, but largely absent from the opposition in terms of the street demonstrations taking place. And I think the reason is that in terms of those who are in opposition, the benchmark has turned to be the current state of constitutional order in Israel. But then that benchmark to be upheld is something that has always been against the status of the Palestinian Arab minority in the state of Israel. Ever since the creation of the state of Israel, you'd find the constitutional order really in opposition to any collective recognition of the Palestinian Arabs in the state, whether it was family unifications after the Nakba, 18 years of military government from 1948 to 1966, confiscation, land day, the incidents of October 2000, preventing family unifications. And even when the Israeli Supreme Court defied the hegemony of the constitutional order, taking a stand maybe at one point or another that would be accommodating, then its decision was kind of overridden by the Israeli Knesset. So I can't name actually one Supreme Court case that was kind of accommodating. And then you would find that it went through and was recognized in practice as a game changer. So we didn't have a Brown decision in Israel. So if we take the Qa'dan case, which is kind of a landmark, right? Even though there was a recognition of equal rights of Arabs to live on land that is owned by the state, it took the Qa'dans as a couple 10 years to get their share in that lot of land in Katsir, right? But even then, there was an amendment to the law in 2011 that would say if you don't belong to the fabric of the township, then you can be denied admission. And then you have the law of Israel as a nation state that kind of explicitly states that the state is about a Jewish settlement and that it seeks to foster. So you can't really find any landmark decision. In some cases, right, the Supreme Court had handed down a decision, but the government did not even enforce it. So if we take the decision of Ikrit and Bir'im, right, a decision that granted a right for inhabitants of Ikrit and Bir'im who were expelled actually on the promise that they will be able to come back. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, I recognize your right to come back to your villages. But that decision was not enforced by the government, even though there were contempt proceedings taken by inhabitants of these two villages against the government. Nonetheless, it wasn't enforced. So if we're speaking about an override clause, my thesis is that Israeli constitutional law has always had this override clause that would enable the Knesset or actually the government to do and to have its way in terms of the Palestinian Arabs. Judicial packing of judges, okay? This is amazing for me as a legal scholar, because in the past 10 years, the ministers of justice have been packing the Israeli judiciary with more conservative judges and justices. I mean, Ayelet Shaked, who was as a minister of justice, is always bragging about having its way in appointing a more conservative judicial force and actually in the Israeli Supreme Court. It's not like we have been having all of these Earl Warrens and William Brennans appointed to the Israeli Supreme Court lately. We're having more and more Rehnquists and more Kavanaughs being appointed to the Israeli Supreme Court. And even that is not satisfying. So this is puzzling for me. What more would you like? What more do you want actually in terms of these judicial reforms in preserving what exactly? And maintaining occupation. I mean, even the Israeli Supreme Court was not that much forthcoming. I guess others would be speaking about it. I mean, it did hand down some decisions. Take the Alon Murray settlement decision back in 1977, right? The Supreme Court kind of granted the petition and said, yeah, you cannot establish Alon Murray, but Alon Murray was just reestablished on an adjacent hill afterwards. So speaking of an override, what exactly are we facing? So in terms of the marginal cost of what is happening in terms of the Palestinian Arabs, actually, we do not have much to lose relative to what exists anyway. And that's why I kind of explain why this minority that is taken to be as the primary stakeholder, as a minority, as a vulnerable minority, if these judicial reforms would take place, or I call them amendments or adjustments, right? Because I don't see them as being revolutionary as they are presented. Because revolutionary to what exactly? For me, it's not that much revolutionary, because I do exist in a state where there is this override, there is this judicial packing, and if I would be losing in terms of my marginal cost, I wouldn't be losing from 100 to 10. I'm at 10 from 100 anyway, so I would be losing maybe from 10 to 5. So that's the marginal cost in terms of the Palestinian Arabs. And that's why I think they are largely absent, quiet, even benevolent when it comes to this upheaval, because in terms of their status, they've lost anyway, and they don't have much to lose more than what they have lost up until now. And so in my article that I wrote, we're always being asked, me, myself, where are you? Why aren't you present? Why aren't you protesting? And actually my answer back is, where were you when we lost all of these human rights on the way? Where were you when there was a military government? Where were you when there are these confiscations taking place? I mean, governments have been speaking of Judaizing the Galilee and the Maqab, Negev, right? Judaizing, bringing more Jewish population in. But what that Judaization is in respect of my status, that I happen to be a problem, that I happen to be a curse, that I have to be dealt with. So do you want me to stand side by side with an opposition that has maintained this order, and therefore I am in opposition, but I'm more benevolent, I'm more quiet about it, because maintaining the existing structure that happens to be now a kind of a benchmark, even if there would be a compromise, that compromise would now be between this benchmark, meaning that what exists today, and in between what these amendments or adjustments are proposing. But there will not be, in any case, right, better than what exists in the current constitutional order.
You have 1 minute, Mike.
Yeah. Lastly, I would conclude with this. In one of my talks, I've kind of quoted Martin Luther King. Maybe in the darkness we can see the stars. Okay, it's dark enough. It has been dark enough in Israel. Maybe now this upheaval can be a springboard for ending occupation, having a Bill of Rights, a proper Bill of Rights, where Qa'dan would not need to fight for equality, that simple right in any democratic order, right, to be equal, where people can vote for any government that governs them. If you live in Tel Aviv, or you live in Ramallah, or you live in Gaza, and you can't call this democratic without having this vote of one person, or this principle of one person, one vote. So hopefully this upheaval will let a lot of people here see some of the stars that do exist, and they do exist if we are willing to look up and look at them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikhail. Omri, Mikhail just mentioned the secret code word a few minutes ago, democracy. Explain that to us. You've written an excellent piece recently on this, and we would love to hear your perspective on the judicial proposals in the context of this debate over Israeli democracy.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'm going to actually read partly from that piece with some tricks, but I want to say a word first. Allow myself to say a word first about Mikhail's comment, just something that I feel I have to say. I'll try to then maybe read faster from the piece that I wanted to read. Mikhail, I share a lot of the things that you say, but there was one thing that I wanted to at least flag, maybe for the discussion later. It is the going down from 10 to 5. Which seems less once you think about not having the 100, which I fully agree with you. But I want to mention this is 50%. And it might be the 50% that can be the most dangerous, right? Because when you go down from the 10% to the 5%, that 5% can be the one where arguably deeper threats arise. And so I think we need to think about that. This is not to complain, far from it. About Palestinians not joining the demonstrations. I think that, as you see from what I want to read, I'm completely in agreement with the point you were making. But I think that we need to worry, and I don't know that that there's no big difference here that will arise, and we need to say that. With this, I can read my comments fast. Many on the Israeli left like to quote a statement by Ahmad Tibi, the long-standing Israeli lawmaker. It will be familiar to many here on the panel. The state of Israel is Jewish and democratic for Jews and Jewish for Arabs. I've often quoted it myself, never quite comfortably, because I think it's inaccurate. A Jewish state is not truly democratic, neither for Arabs nor for Jews. Democracy depends on the rule of law, and the rule of law depends on complete civil equality, as well as on subjecting everyone, including the sovereign government, to the same law. In democracies, where the people, not say a king, is a sovereign, the rule of law therefore depends on the principle that the state equally belongs to all of its citizens. The people are sovereign, and they are defined as a set of all citizens. In Israel, where the people designates Jews rather than citizens as such, this principle is not just violated. There is a consensus, at least among Jewish citizens, we see this in the demonstrations, we see this in the opposition, that it is illegitimate. Today, many of those Jewish citizens are fighting to defend the courts, the rule of law, and the separation of powers from assault by the new radical right Israeli government. But we tend to forget that Jewish Israelis have always opposed the rule of law in its true significance. The law in Israel never truly ruled over the people's will. In the state of the Jewish people, the people rule and use the law to ensure their will, that is, to uphold Jewish sovereignty rather than the sovereignty of the country's citizens and inhabitants. And I think that here really lies the heart of the issue. Again, it goes back to some of the comments that Mikhail was also making. When the sovereign can use the law as a tool, the rule of law becomes an empty shell, and the human and civil rights of everyone, Palestinians, Jews, minority, majority, are in danger. So it is that the newly elected government actually seems to express the people's will, the Jews, who have elected to deepen the rule as more and more Jewish and less democratic over a population that is partly Jewish and partly Palestinian. By the way, people speak nowadays of the fear that the tyranny of the majority will be created or that it will be possible. This is in many ways a tyranny of the minority, if you consider the actual statistics between the river and the sea. The laws and the principles that were originally intended to ensure Jewish above citizens' sovereignty now allows the government to pursue this anti-democratic trend such that at this point, even the rights of Jews stand to be jeopardized. It has never been clearer, I think, and that might be the situation that, again, Mikhail mentioned when in the darkness you see the stars. It has never been clearer that the human and civil rights of Jews and Palestinians are necessarily interdependent. A democratic alternative to the current situation will only emerge if we form a Jewish-Palestinian solidarity that will be based on this insight and promote full civil partnership in the state of all its citizens. If this can be created or not, we can maybe talk in Q&A. Now, the deepest threat to this kind of partnership is not the current coalition's reform plan, which in fact aims to release the government from the authority of the courts. It is, for example, a clause like Section 7A of Basic Law of the Knesset, which prohibits the participation in elections of candidates who deny, and this is a quote, the existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. On a first look, the spirit behind this law is a principle of militant democracy, what the Germans call Wehrhafte Demokratie, formulated in the aftermath of the Weimar Republic, stating that democracy's enemies must be prevented from using elections to abolish the sovereignty of the citizens. As we all know, the Nazis came to power democratically. Israel at first seems to have adopted the same principle and only extended it to protect not just democracy, but the state's Jewish identity as well. But on a closer examination, the country has actually implemented the exact opposite lesson from the ones that democracy have learned from Weimar. The Israeli version of the law is not intended to protect the sovereignty of the citizens from the will of the people. That was what we learned from Weimar, but the will of the people from the sovereignty of the citizens. And as if we have not learned anything from history, we're now surprised, perhaps some of us here aren't, when the golem that is called the will of the people now suddenly rises not only against the Palestinians, but also against its creator. Now, facing this situation, Justice Esther Chayut, the president of Israel's Supreme Court, went out of her way to courageously, I think it should be stated, courageously defend the courts. In an unprecedented speech, she warned that if this government's reforms will be implemented, and this is a quote from her now famous speech, the country's democratic identity will be fatally damaged. Anyone who claims that the majority chose its representatives and wrote them a blank check bears the name of democracy in vain, end quote. So no doubt, Esther Chayut speaks out of the sincere anxiety for the future of the country, but she should be advised to examine herself too when speaking in the name of democracy. Just a few months before, as a Supreme Court president, she used Clause 7A to criticize the participation of the Palestinian Israeli party, Balad, in Israel's elections. Whereas Chayut eventually did allow, we should notice that this is what she did, she allowed the party to run. She said, in fact, threatened that the party's participation in future elections is anything but ensured. I think that the whole voting and running to parliament of Arab parties in Israel is thereby threatened. It is not ensured because it has dared promoting a bill supporting Israel as a state of all its citizens. That is, according to Israel's Supreme Court, a party's willingness to uphold the fundamental principle of the rule of law, really, not the opposition to this principle, constitutes, this is a quote from the decision, a gravely serious evidence against it and may lead to disqualification. It is not surprising that a court that used the law to prevent the sovereignty of all citizens then permitted, in the same breath, the running of Jewish power, Otzma Yehudit, a party that is safely labeled as fascist. It calls on its platform for a total war against the enemies of Israel, meaning the Palestinian inhabitants and citizens of the country who do not belong to the Jewish people. In this Weimarian farce, the court has been cast as a tragic hero after joining hands with the Knesset and using a principle such as 7A.
1 minute, Omri.
After being willing to use the courts to defend the will of the people from the fact that a democracy must belong to all citizens, regardless of religion or ethnicity, they woke up one day and discovered that the people has chosen to crush the courts entirely as part of the war against the enemies. I'll speak another minute. Now, many speak nowadays about the need to answer the situation by finally writing a constitution for Israel. In principle, a constitution is a great idea, I think, but it would be an awful one if it will be written in the same mindset that I've just described above. As we know from the literature, constitutions are often not documents of emancipation, but weapons of oppression. A constitution written as Israel occupies the Palestinians will, I think, without doubt, belong to the latter category. We have no right to write a constitution as long as we occupy the Palestinians. In terms of content, a valid constitution will have to overcome the idea that the authority of law draws on the power of the Jews' right to sovereignty. A valid constitution must begin with human dignity as a source of valid authority, not the people's sovereignty, not Jews, and by the way, also not Palestinians. So while I'm very skeptical of people like Yair Lapid now suggesting a constitution, perhaps the task of formulating such a document could be a worthy one for those who attempt to gather the forces, Jewish and Palestinians, however few, who might be fighting together to create the rule of law in a state that belongs to its citizens, not to protect the political system that is leading to its destruction. I'm done.
Thank you, Omri. Let's move to Amira Hass, correspondent of Haaretz in the occupied Palestinian territories, as we continue to focus on what was just described as an impediment, occupation impediment to even a positive suggestion as a constitution for Israel. So to talk about the impact of this current government policy and legislative plan on the Palestinians and on the occupation, Amira, you have 10 minutes. The microphone is yours.
Hi, and thank you for inviting me. We have learned over the years that when it comes to Israeli policy against the Palestinians, it can always get worse. And there is no need for special new legislation reform for this. And it certainly has gone worse for the very basic reason that Israel has never given up on its settler colonial tactics, features, and aspirations, at least in Gaza and the West Bank. Back in the early 90s, the PLO and Israeli peace camp and some of the, and we could say also the Western countries who supported the Oslo process hoped that this settler colonial feature of Israel will be halted, at least at the Green Line. And even though these words were not used as such. But Israel carried on with this policy under the guise of the peace process, so-called peace process, ever since, and never stopped it. So the worsening of Palestinian condition in Gaza and the West Bank is inbuilt in the system, and in the Israeli refusal to acknowledge the Palestinian national rights. Again, I feel that the legislation, the reform so-called, is not the reason for the worsening, is not the reason, is not the vehicle of the worsening that we are facing, that we are already facing, and that we will unfortunately very probably face in the coming months. But first, I would like to stress and to remind us of some of the main components, not all of them, of the Israeli policy towards the Palestinians, at least in the past 30 years. Not only, but mainly so, and again, under the guise of a peace process. A first component was to disconnect the population of Gaza from that of the West Bank. And this is in total contrast to the promises of the Oslo Accords. And at the same time, to shattering the Palestinian social fabric in Jerusalem while disconnecting it from the rest of the Palestinians. Another component, very visible one, when you follow the map of the West Bank, is the fragmentation of the Palestinian expanse in the West Bank. Israel kept enlarging the settlement areas to the point that they are now special, integral part of Israel itself. An Israeli who drives from Jerusalem to the northern part of the country through the Jordan Valley cannot know that he or she are driving in occupied territory. It all looks very Israeli. The roads, the signs, everything looks very Israeli. And the Palestinian villages are just decoration. So on this part, so on the one hand, it's the expansion of settlements. On the other hand, condensing Palestinians into the designated pockets of territory. You can call it Bantustans, reservations, pale of settlements, whatever, but these are designated pockets of territory that can be disconnected from each other at any moment and to be closed and not allow movement inside or outside like Gaza is. Another component is the obstruction of Palestinian economy, as limited as it can be, by the very control over 61% of the West Bank, the so-called an artificial category of C areas, where Israel has full hand at planning and administering, not only in security, not only security-wise. It has a free hand at restricting the freedom of movement of Palestinians outside the country, inside the country. It poses monetary obstacles to Palestinian trade and labor and industry. The siege over Gaza is, of course, has a major effect on Palestinian economy, and it constantly meddles with Palestinian revenues. In other words, it steals Palestinian revenues for different so that the Palestinian budget and the finance ministry is never able to plan properly. Another very clear component was and has been got its own world attention for the right reasons, is the encouragement of settlers' violence. Settlers are violent because the Israeli authorities and courts and the attorney general and the police and the army have always been amazingly lenient towards this violence. So to the point that we say it's encouragement, it's not just leniency or weakness or impotence. And of course, another component which comes with it as a natural part is the policy of military and police brutal repression of Palestinians that costs the life and health of many and aggravates the sense of uncertainty and helplessness that the majority of Palestinians, if not all, feel on a daily basis. So all this was before this government came to power, and it was under different coalitions where the centrist parties were part of, not I don't call them leftist, of course. They were part of these coalitions and of these governments that implemented this policy over the years. So why should we be alarmed? I do think that we have to be alarmed, and we should be alarmed, not because, not so much, doesn't have to do much with the legislation, though it is part of it, but because of the following facts. The very identity, and it was of course mentioned before by Omri, the very identity of the main actors of this government and their personality. The world has come now was exposed more to the main malicious settler leaders that became key actors in this government and main ministers who directly govern over the Palestinians and the policies against them. These are, of course, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and all their satellites in their party and in Likud. And they are part of the settler movement that has always benefited, it did not create, but it benefited from the official policies of colonization, but it always knew how to enhance them, how to promote them, how to to put into it even much more venom and racism than the official policymakers intended or dared to express. Now, the danger is that these ministers, both Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, were not shy at proposing their solution, so-called solution. And this is a mass expulsion of Palestinians. I'm not saying it as a prophecy, I'm saying it as a warning. They are capable, and now with this legislation, with the total lack of any supervision of that was always very meager when it comes to the Palestinians, as was mentioned before, but they will feel even more encouraged to push towards those solutions. And this might be possible because for so many years, the great majority of the Israeli society, who now, many of them are now protesting against the coup, and rightly so, they have totally grown accustomed to the policies against the Palestinians. They supported them in great part, or ignored them, or ignored their severity. So they are not even, even if they understand now, part of them, not all of them, the danger of the new government vis-a-vis the Palestinians, they're not even equipped to stop it or to challenge it. Another reason, another element which is very alarming is that this Israeli policies over the past 30 years, the very fact that it used a so-called peace process, I mean, it's so cynical to call it a peace process, it used it in order to weaken the Palestinian body politic. And it is indeed, this Palestinian body politic, it is weak also for its own merits, if I can say so. But it is so weak, it is so at a loss that any Israeli policy today and any worsening of Israeli policy is not being challenged by the Palestinians. Really,
please conclude, Amira.
Okay. So there is a lack of unified strategy. The leaderships are untrusted. The Hamas militarization is not a game changer, even though some people applaud it, but it is not. It cannot really challenge the Israeli machine of colonization, and so are the armed groups in the West Bank. They are popular because they express the despair of the people, but they are not a challenge. And the Palestinian Authority is struggling to maintain the non-existent status quo for its own nomenclature and benefits and very restricted benefits. So we are in a very, very critical stage where very dangerous Israeli group can initiate mass expulsions worse than before, and nobody to stand against it.
Thank you, Amira. Appreciate that. Let's go ahead and move on. Mairav, who is a senior analyst on Israel-Palestine at the International Crisis Group. The microphone is yours. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I just want to echo what Amira said, because even though the topic is, for me, U.S.-Israel relations and the judicial overhaul, the threats right now to Palestinians are the most concerning thing that's happening on the ground here. I think much more than anything else. So it's important to keep that in mind, but certainly as far as my hat as a conflict prevention person. So I think it's important to keep in mind that the rise of this government, this far-right government, on its own is extremely alarming and historical as far as the US is concerned, the West is concerned, and Jews are concerned, because when you think about it, Israel was created in the ashes of the Holocaust to be this kind of what they call the light unto the nations, a liberal beacon, a safe place. So I think, this far-right government, even though all of the things that they're doing are a culmination of things that were already in place and anti-democratic legislation that Netanyahu has led for years, it's not anything new. But the shock with which this government came in so explicitly racist, anti-Palestinian, anti-liberal values, the court system is something that I think has taken many people by alarm and is creating a paradigm shift, a new paradigm in Israel relations with the West. Israel is aligned much more today with the global far right, with the Christian right, as far as its values, as far as the way that the leadership runs the country. This is something that, again, is not new, but is very, very explicit. And I think that's creating huge rifts between the US and Israel specifically. If we look at what's happening right now, you have a sort of crisis in US-Israel relations, and it's not actually directly only related to the judicial issues. It has to do specifically with Israel's policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians. The language that Smotrich has been using is something that has alarmed the White House, talking about wiping out villages. He's doing it, from a position of finance minister and minister in the defense ministry, effectively a governor of the West Bank. And he's doing it with the full legitimacy of being a minister in Israel's government. And so, that on its own, and the fact that he's boycotted, basically what we have right now is a sort of quiet boycott by the American administration of this Israeli administration. Netanyahu has not been invited to the White House. That's something that's new in Israel-America relations, at least the last, I think, 20 years or more. And I don't know if he's going to get that invitation. And, considering the way he's acting, I hope he doesn't. You had the summoning of the Israeli ambassador because they just passed a law that essentially walks back the evacuation of 4 settlements in the northern West Bank during Sharon's period in 2005. And this is also a way that Israel is openly saying to the US, we don't respect previous agreements. I mean, again, anybody paying attention knows that Israel doesn't do that anyway. But here it's doing it with such kind of gall and openness. It's pushing the envelope to the point where the US has to act. And of course, because of years and years of the US treating Israel with impunity, I don't necessarily think that it's going to do that much. But if there were ever a time for the US to act on Israeli actions, it is today with this government. So we have yet to see how it's going to, really do something about what's happening. For now, it's mostly rhetoric. And we'll have to see. As far as the US-Israel relationship and American Jews are involved, I mean, the way that American Jews, I think, are experiencing what's happening, I mean, first of all, you have very different constituencies in America and Israel, whereas in America, they voted Trump out. In Israel, the young generation voted this government in. So you have different, social and political and cultural directions of each society. And you also have, progressive Jews who have for years already been alienated from Israel. And, those who are engaged are only interested in working to end the occupation. But for the mainstream American Jewish community, obviously, this is something that is for the first time, I think we've seen people like Michael Bloomberg and Abraham Foxman and very, very pro-Israel Democrats saying, wow, like if Israel ceases to be a democracy, at least as far as they consider Israel to be a liberal democracy, then it will make them uncomfortable. They won't be able to justify supporting Israel. And they've said that openly. So you have a situation now in which, the American Jewish and US alliance with Israel is based on these shared democratic values, the interests of the Jewish community and the connection it has, and then also the regional interests that the US and Israel share militarily and politically. And on all these issues, I think right now you have serious challenges and questions. Arguably none of that applies right now. Israel is not pushing democratic values in any way. It's doing the opposite. The Jewish community is clearly estranged at this point from Israel. And as far as regional interests, I mean, I don't think we're going to have time to get into Iran and everything, but the US and Israel have actually very different approaches to Iran, even though the goal is the same, which is, to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon and to keep stability as much as possible in the Middle East. But the US right now, I don't think sees eye to eye with how Israel is trying to approach that situation. Certainly Netanyahu has created, internal rife between the Democrats and Republicans on this issue for years. So the U.S.-Israel relationship hangs in the balance as well. And then as far as the Jewish people, I think what's very clear from the last few months, especially, is that the Jewish people, even though Bezalel Smotrich went to the U.S. and said we're one people and we have to stay united. No, actually, Jews are not one monolithic people. They're not united. There's Jews that are supportive of Trump. There's Jews that support ethnic transfer of Palestinians. And there's Jews that, want Israel to be a democracy and Jews that don't. So that doesn't really hold water anymore. That's not something that can keep the Jewish people united. And I think for a lot of Americans and Israelis, frankly, this is a very, very difficult and sad time for them because even the minimum liberal democratic values that they wanted to keep are falling apart. And I think on this issue, it's interesting to see how, for example, the Air Force combat fighters and other, units who are now refusing to show up for training, who say they refuse to serve, they basically are saying we had a contract with a country that is supposed to be Jewish and democratic. And if it's no longer one of those things, then we're no longer willing to cooperate with it. It's important to note that it didn't find it problematic to serve when Israel was bombing Gaza or when Israel drops bombs anywhere. This is what is making Air Force pilots stop serving. So I think all the other panelists already made very clear that the fight here is not over democracy and civic equality in general. The fight here is over preserving a Jewish democracy. And for most Israelis, that is the fight. And I think for most American Jews, that is the fight as well. So this is something that also I wanted to talk about Omri's mentioning of the tyranny of the minority. It's true that when you look at the population, it's about half and half from the river to the sea. But I think it is right to say that there could and will and is a certain tyranny of the majority in the sense that within the Jewish community that has power here, the majority seems to be okay with obviously not the judicial overhaul, but with the tyranny of this democracy for Jews only. And that has brought us to this point. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. I think I'll stop here and we can discuss.
Thank you, Mairav. And actually, to illustrate your point regarding the U.S.-Israeli relations and the damage done to that, it's kind of interesting that today, the Jerusalem Post, which is not known to be necessarily the most progressive part of the media world in Israel, its editorial, main editorial is Netanyahu causing cumulative damage to U.S.-Israeli ties. So that kind of illustrates the seriousness of the actual damage. Thank you. Noga, would you like to make some comments before we move to the Q&A session?
I would. Thank you very much. I also want to wish a happy Ramadan to anybody who is watching us and is celebrating this evening. It's an important day. I want to actually circle back to Professor Karayanni's comments at the beginning, or part of them. I want to highlight a few points that come from my day-to-day work covering the protests and the government actions that have spurred these protests, because I think it is important to underscore what has kind of burst the dam in Israel. Many of the issues brought up by the panelists who spoke before me have to do with what Jewish society in Israel was willing to tolerate or to accept or even to support over decades. And what we see now is that the dam has burst. So I want to bring up the example that he mentioned of the famous Kaadan case, which was, for anyone who doesn't follow Israeli legal precedent, a case of a demand for equality in the ability to live in any specific city, neighborhood, or in Israel, that Arabs couldn't be rejected. And as he said, that it's a case that took 10 years. What we're talking about in my opinion, what we're talking about in the case of what the government calls a judicial reform, and what I think more precisely should be called an illegal attempt to take power. What we're talking about is a situation where the Kaadan family would have no framework to even file this petition for justice. Forget suffering the humiliation of 10 years of waiting or all the other humiliations mentioned here. We're talking about an entire framework collapsing. And the language is important to me because I believe that every time we use the term judicial reform, judicial package, in a way, we're giving free PR to an Israeli government that wants us to believe that this is a judicial reform, which is an eminently relatable and justifiable thing to do, like an educational reform, like other reforms that every society needs. In fact, in my view, this is, in Spanish, we have the perfect term, una toma del poder. This is an attempt to illicitly take power. And I do feel that that's the correct way to understand why so many Israelis are so enraged and what has made this dam burst. It's an attempt to collapse the entire framework, which was eminently criticizable to begin with. That is the main thing I wanted to say. Finally, I'd like to recommend for everybody to read Amira Hass's recent piece in Haaretz, which really very neatly describes what also came up here, a tyranny of the minority in the respect of Israel having become an appendage to the entire settlement project through this government. I think that's enough for me for now.
Thank you, Noga. I think it's interesting what you just mentioned about this illicit takeover of power, because frankly, I was in a kind of closed door debate a couple of weeks ago, and there was an article by an Israeli opposition person basically saying that this is not essentially judicial reform. What is happening is a coup d'etat. Are you in agreement with that statement?
I'm very much in agreement. I know that the term coup d'etat has become almost a useless term in the Israeli context, principally because the current prime minister, Netanyahu, has been using it wantonly for several years now, basically since he was indicted on serious crimes. He has used the term coup d'etat to accuse the media, the judiciary, the police, you name it, of perpetrating a coup d'etat against him. And so now it somehow feels meaningless to use the term inside of Israel. But certainly if we're speaking in English into the outer world, I think it is a useful term to explain. Again, I'm reaching back to Spanish for a useful term. In Latin America, this is called autogolpe. In other words, you do a coup d'etat on yourself, which is a way of being able to try and hold on to power. It's, again, you know, let's say judicial reform. This is what this government is doing, is using legislative tools, as Omri was discussing very clearly before, in an attempt to change the entire box, the entire rule of the game, and be able to hold on to power. And I do feel that it shouldn't be an opposition or coalition thing. It is important not to use the terms that the government has chosen, because we're not here to do PR for the government. We're here to try and seriously analyze what's going on.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Noga. We will spend the balance of our time, about 30 minutes, in the art of conversation, trying to respond to questions from the audience. We have, like I said earlier, rather international audience, as always these days. And the first questions come from Ziad Bubakr. Essentially, I'm going to pass that to at least two of you in the sense that there are two parts to the questions. First to Mikhail, based on what we have heard from all of you guys, so what are the Palestinians to do, since you all agree about the nature of the system in Israel as a settler colonial kind of apartheid state? What do you expect that the Palestinians should do at this time? Khalil?
Yeah. Well, actually, it's not as simple as that. I think you do react, as I said, to what the possible cost to you is. Now, I happen to be a bit in disagreement with Noga, right? I mean, if you take the Qa'dan precedent, right, Noga, okay, it was virtually abolished, right? And there was no rage, right? It's not like now it's going to be curtailed that they would have nothing, but it actually was abolished way back in 2011, and there was no rage, right? So the puzzling question is, what makes this opposition tick, if any, right? It's not really what matters to the minority. That's my impression, because if that was the case, there was a lot of occasions in the past where you should have ticked and people should have gone to the streets opposing, right? But nonetheless, this did not happen. I mean, there's a lasting, it's occupation. It's not even occupation. I see it more as an annexation in effect, right? It's not, as far as Israel is concerned, at least the government is always speaking in the international arena. It's temporary, but to the constituency of Netanyahu or Smotrich, no, it's not temporary. It's lasting. This is Eretz Israel, and it's not even the West Bank. It's even the East Bank, right? As Smotrich is concerned. So, what we can do. Going back actually to the question, yeah, I think we should raise our voices. We're going to be losing something. There would be a chilling effect going to the courts. That is something that is going to happen. But actually, this is what we should be doing. It should be raising our voices to the international community, trying to get some more pressure, because it's right that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have these intentions, and Amira Hass is warning us, but there is another development that I think I didn't sense in the past, is that the international community is awakening. It's doing something. It's doing something that it didn't do before, right? Maybe side by side with the warning, maybe it's a wake-up call. Look at what is happening, and we as Palestinian Arabs should be more vocal in terms of sounding our opposition, our demonstration, not necessarily standing side by side with all of the flag holders in Tel Aviv, but we have our own flags and we have our own narrative that we can put forward in other means, and I think that is something that we should do. And I guess that some of our human rights organizations are actually doing at present. So that's the short answer. A longer answer would need some more time. Which
that would require another webinar, I think. Yes, but I fully agree with you, Khalil. Based, from the vantage point of being here in Washington, this is a huge opening for the Palestinian Arab community in Israel to raise its voice. It's very important. There is a lot of receptivity when you consider the fact that 40+% of Democrats in this country now have more sympathy for the Palestinian case than it is for Israel, which is traditional within And that's the party that is headed by a Zionist named President Biden. So it's very important to take opportunity of this opening. And again, the Jewish community would probably more than engage as a partner with that when you have 40% of youth in the Jewish community that are not objecting to Israel being described as apartheid based on what we have heard from you today. The second part of the question from Ziad, Mairav, he says essentially, does the U.S. understand this, that what we are talking about?
Well, you'd have to ask them what they understand, but I think the crux here is that it looks really bad. The image of Israel right now looks really bad for them, and not to undermine again the severity of what's happening here, but they want to go to the status quo ante, which is the same as the protesters. They want to preserve what has been. So they want Israel to have this image of being a liberal democracy. And then if it loses that, then it changes the rules of the game. So that's what I think the US is concerned with right now. Yeah.
Omri, you referred in your remarks about the potential or the suggestion for a new constitution in Israel, and you highlighted why this is probably very difficult, if not impossible. I want to reverse the question for you a little bit. What needs to be done in Israel to justify an attempt to write a constitution?
Well, I would separate between writing a constitution and constituting a constitution. So actually, bringing forth a constitution that would be binding. Everybody can write a constitution on the back of a napkin. Actually constituting
it has been done before. We know the napkin.
Yeah, some have accused me of doing this. The act of actually constituting a constitution would require quite a lot. Either a legitimate separation from the Palestinian and the establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state, something that I doubt very much, to put it mildly, that is going to happen, or a constitution that will be written as part, say, of a federation or a confederation. I prefer a federation, and I think there is a difference. Those would be the conditions in which a constitution could be written, but those are things that are, we can now imagine in a very far-fetched future. I think that the scenarios that Amira was describing are, unfortunately, and I say this, it's painful to say it, are more likely than writing a constitution in a federation anytime soon. Still, it doesn't mean, again, that that the act of discussing a constitution, debating such a document, that could perhaps, also in a far-fetched future, but maybe less far-fetched, help uniting a certain front of people who are on the border of, on the one hand, going to those demonstrations with the Israel flags, on the other hand, could be maybe pushed to see the necessity of a more genuine democracy. Could perhaps be a way of challenging them. I'm thinking in Israel of a place, like the orphans of Meretz, the people in Machon Zulat, for those who know this. Not the institutions that I identify with, however, places where I think people would feel the pressure if presented with a legitimate constitution. Can they be, say, encouraged to go with Balad, with a joint list? Could even, I know this would surprise many, could even maybe the quote-unquote decent Jabotinskyite liberal Likud leaders, Dan Meridor, Ruby Rivlin, be convinced that something like that is not so far away from a 21st century Jabotinsky. Again, I think this is a dream. This is completely far-fetched. However, it is less far-fetched than actually constituting a constitution in a federation at the moment, and it could perhaps be a way of starting to think of something very minor, very, just going in a very narrow crack and trying to do something constructive.
But if I understand you correctly, what you're saying, should Israel move in that direction miraculously, it can't be just a Jewish effort. It has to be, in a way, a joint effort by all citizens of Israel, in a way.
I would be in favor of, well, I cannot imagine how this is going to be done. One way, perhaps one way in which to imagine a bridge for the beginning is to see this as a genuinely joint work of Palestinian Israelis with Jews, and through that also with Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. I definitely would favor and would think that only a constitution that does it with representatives from the West Bank and Gaza would be legitimate as an actual constitution. I'll tell you that there was an attempt to gather intellectuals to actually have such a conference that faltered, that did not get off the ground, and maybe it was not such a bad thing. I immediately said that I think we should invite Palestinians not just from Israel, but from the West Bank and Gaza. They should be included. I can imagine, I have no strong opposition to beginning, at least, with Palestinians and Jews within Israel to imagine such a document. That would be a document that, for that reason, would be speaking of full equality. And then from the premise of full equality, it would just enable saying, look, if this is about full equality, then the only way to do justice to that premise is to speak about joint sovereignty on the whole territory. Mm-hmm. Something along those lines. I think this is very far-fetched, so I don't want to be misunderstood about actually thinking that this now will make a difference. There may be, I'll say another word, there may be a difference here between doing two things. One is trying to solve the crisis, which is the current crisis in Israel, which is almost by definition then speaking about a certain compromise. And one very different thing is to maybe see whether the crisis can be used also in order to try to begin to speak about alternatives. And those are not the same things. And if we will be saddled to the need to hope that we can actually now solve the crisis or actually produce a democratic situation, we will not be able to move forward. So a certain will to believe that we can act even where things now seem very, very bad, very far-fetched. Perhaps it's not a bad idea to allow ourselves to imagine a little bit and move in those directions. Look where Ben-Gvir was a few years ago. Ben-Gvir was in a completely illegitimate corner. True, something in the structure of Israeli assumptions made Ben-Gvir deeply legitimate. He can be legitimized in ways that I think most of us here probably wouldn't be. Still, it was completely marginalized, completely marginalized. And it is possible that also a genuine democratic opposition, if it's working persistently, could one day have more power than we imagine. Anyway, I'll stop here.
Thanks, Omri. We'll move to Amira Hass. You have a couple of questions. One from Jan Menz. Where would the masses of Palestinians be expelled to, practically speaking, by the Israeli government should it move in that direction? What shape would such expulsion take?
Look, as I said, I don't prophesize, I warn. I don't want to start and you know, delineate the features of this obscenity that I want to warn about it in order to prevent it from happening, not to pave the road to picture it like a film. But I would say this: the right wing and this settlers' right wing, the colonizers' right wing, are always have always supported Israeli going out to wars. And because at wars you can achieve what you cannot do in times of quiet. And one of them is mass expulsions. So you have, in wars, I mean, not only against Gaza, but also regional wars. Why does the Israeli extreme right wing support going out against Iran? Why did it support the war of United States that now we commemorate 20 years against Iraq? because it hopes for changes, political changes that such wars can cause, and implement some more radical, some more extreme plans of theirs. That's about what? About where? Once there is such a war, the where is not important. But again, we have to be aware of this danger and of this, Smotrich just said it openly, that there are three options for Palestinians to surrender and accept that they are not a people and they are not, and they will not have national rights, surrender, emigrate, or get killed at wars if they resist. He said it openly. I mean, it's not secret. And that's his policy and the philosophy of many who live in the West Bank, many settlers, and they are not being stopped by the softer right wing. So again, we have to be careful not to prophesize. We have to warn in order to prevent it from happening.
Another question for you from Samar Shihabi. Considering what you mentioned about the divisions that exist in the Palestinian community, particularly in the West Bank and between the West Bank and Gaza, of course, and the failure of the two main groupings, Fatah and Hamas, to kind of measure up to dealing with the level of crisis we are talking about. Do you see possibly the emergence of a new movement with a common agenda, whether it is equal rights for everyone between the river and the sea, or focus on ending occupation? Do you see the seeds of that as emerging in this at this time?
Yeah, look, I have two hats, one as a leftist and one as a journalist who lives here. So as a leftist, of course, I believe, it's inbuilt, the belief in the change and the power of people to change. And to improve or to revolutionize the reality in the good sense of the word. This is as a leftist, or you could call it also naive or romantic, or I don't know what. But as somebody who lives and sees this reality, I'm afraid that right now we are very far away from this. I think that there has been a tremendous regression in terms of acknowledging each other's rights. We talk a lot against the two-state solution. I hate the word solution because I think solution is about something final, and there is no final phase in history. Every phase leads to another. The question is how benign we make the phase. How can we impact the next phase to be benign and beneficiary for the peoples? But the two states implied in it mutual recognition of the existence of two peoples in this country and their right to live here. And there is a tremendous regression in this mutual recognition on both parts. And it's very understandable on the part of the Palestinians because it is a reaction to Israeli policies and Israeli cynical abuse of a political process. But still, we have to go back to the stage where both peoples acknowledge and accept the right, the existence of the other people. So we are very far away from building a movement of two peoples in the one country.
Noga, this is a question from William Gant, basically asking, how does this end? Are we going to see mass civil obedience? I mean, the reference that was made, and I'm looking at a news item today, actually, Israel's military reservists speak out against judicial reform. I mean, stuff we never heard before in Israeli politics. The military splits and getting involved in these mass demonstrations. Are we seeing something similar to the mass civil obedience, obedience like in Egypt in 2011? And then what?
I'm also not a prophet, but
aren't we? We all
yeah,
are not,
I mean, you're not the first person to ask if this isn't an Israeli spring, right?
Yeah.
inspired by Egypt. I have to say, I think it's different. I could be wrong. I think it's different because in Egypt, it was a revolution, a people's revolution against a cruel regime. You could say the same for Israel, but in Israel, it is an uprising of people who want to retain a system of government that is currently being threatened. You're absolutely right. To my knowledge, Israel has never seen anything even resembling the degree of civil disobedience that we're seeing on the part of military reservists. And it's a complex term because at least in the United States, when you use the term military reserve, it has nothing to do with what is a reservist in Israel. The bulk of active duty military in Israel are in fact reservists, or people who completed their years of conscription, of obligatory draft, and who then out of personal commitment basically remain a more or less active part of the military for decades. This is officially an act of volunteerism by these people after their official duties in the military are over. And that's something that this government obviously didn't take into account. I don't know how it will end. And I have to say, I don't think anybody knows. And I want to emphasize, I don't think the Prime Minister knows. In other words, it is absolutely clear that this government never foresaw anything close to not just the civil disobedience. Israel has been shut down today. Anyone trying to travel between one city and another today couldn't do so. The Likud ministers who attempted to speak at public events today were either screamed off stage or ended up not showing up out of fear, including the Prime Minister, who today canceled for the third time a public appearance. So the impact is significant. We may be, by the way, 2 hours ahead of a major change. The latest news here is that the defense minister is about to break away from the government. So let's keep in account that this is very much a live event. What I do think is that Israel, whatever happens now in terms of this package of legislation, Israel will be completely changed. And I don't think anyone can really predict. If this package of laws ends up passing as is, I think we will see Israel enter failed state status much quicker than many people foresee. I think there will be, as the governor of the Bank of Israel said, I think there will be an immediate massive brain drain. I think the economy could crash again much quicker than people foresee. Israel is, at the end of the day, a small country, and such a massive event will be felt almost universally immediately.
Yeah.
Anyway,
No,
I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
one last point. If this package of laws, for whatever reason, is not passed or does not continue in the blitz it has been in now, I still think that a sort of devil has been let loose onto the streets of Israel. And I don't think that this government announcing even tonight a pause in the legislation is going to put that devil back into the hiding place it was in before.
Yeah, thank you, Noga. No, I was going to mention essentially that for a couple of days now, Netanyahu has been using the Gallant Guard in trying to pressure his own coalition to drop, if you will, or to split their legislative agenda into pieces and bits in order to blunt some of the criticism, both domestic and international, by saying that Gallant is about to resign, so there is a price to pay. But again, I mean, it's very hard to take a Machiavellian politician like Netanyahu so seriously. He's even using that to his advantage. At the same time, today, you mentioned newsy things. I will add one more. Israel just ratified a law limiting conditions for a Netanyahu ouster. I mean, we're back to the accusation that this whole business is about saving Netanyahu from going to jail. And what they passed today is this incapacity reinterpretation. When is the prime minister incapacitated and can be changed? And that shows that there is some truth to this accusation. Go ahead and finish your thought, Noga.
I think there's an enormous amount of truth to what you just said. And I think it's extremely significant that the first bill passed into law by this government as part of its package to change the regime in the state is a personal law, basically granting Netanyahu a kind of total immunity, absolute immunity. The guy could have a stroke this evening, be medically incapacitated, and there's no mechanism now in place for any body outside of himself or his own cabinet to rule him unfit. So this is absolutely, clearly inconsistent with any kind of proper rule of law.
Sounds so familiar. You know, remember the statement, I could kill somebody on Park Avenue or Fifth Avenue and nothing will happen to me?
100%. 100%.
Looks like someone is stealing a page from someone else's book or scenario, I guess.
Just to circle back to your comments about Gallant, I agree with you about Netanyahu. He's a master at trying to turn any event, literally anything, to his own advantage. He's very good at it, but we don't know what Gallant is going to say this evening. I don't expect him to resign, but clearly something significant is underway, and Netanyahu will try to turn it to his advantage. But what we haven't mentioned is not only is so much of the current disaster in Israel simply the result of a indicted criminal under stress who has agreed to egregious coalition partners thinking he'll save his own skin.
Yeah,
it's open. It's out in the open, and we have to see if he's still able to pull this magic off. I think things are really on edge right now.
All right, let me conclude with this question from one of my colleagues here at Arab Center, Dr. Imad Harb, and I would direct that to Mairav. How much of what is going on in Israel right now is a translation, in a way, of what's happening here in the States with the Republicans stacking the courts, gerrymandering, allowing local councils to impose rules and laws, etc. Do you see a parallel between the two, Mairav?
Yes, except that the US has a constitution and two houses of government.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously, there's a difference in how much power can be consolidated. But I mean, there's no doubt that there are similarities in the personalities of Netanyahu and Trump, and also in something that we touched on a minute ago, which is that even if certain laws don't pass, the incitement, the rhetoric, the reality on the ground, the actions that are already taken, specifically the incitement against the media, and also in Israel specifically, the landscape of the media, it plays a huge role in normalizing what are immoral, illegal acts of all kinds. I think it's very similar to Trump in that sense. I just think that there's a lot more checks and balances, and there's also a real opposition to those things in America. And here, the political opposition is much weaker on that level.
Thanks, Mairav. Quick question regarding from John Mason. The difference in terms of what you mentioned, Mikhail, earlier on in your remarks about it doesn't make a difference to the Palestinians in a way. They are on the short end of the stick, if we understood you correctly. If that's the case, Israeli control of Palestinians will continue to encroach on their rights, to oppress them, to diminish their rights, regardless of these changes in the judiciary. In a way, what are they to do? Just roll with the punch and take it?
Yeah, I mean, well, there was two initiatives actually of a constitution in Israel. One by the Israeli Democracy Institute at the turn of the century, and it was taken over by the Knesset. And there are texts about a possible constitution, but they led nowhere in terms of really culminating into a constitutional document in Israel. I think the strife is so great that even finding something in common to agree on is impossible under the current conditions. So not that we should not be moving forward in trying maybe to solve some of these issues. But there were some attempts that did not succeed. I mean, and I think there are a number of big elephants in the room. What is the occupation? What to do with the occupied territories? If you can't solve this major problem, I don't think you can move internally in Israel if you can even define that as being internally without the West Bank. So what is internal here is another question. How can you have a constitution when you don't have any definition of what your borders are? So who is your constituency? How can you do a constitution without defining who is exactly the constituency here? And once you can't resolve these major issues, and that was the impediment then, Omri, right? Once you don't solve these issues, you can get nowhere in respect of a constitution. And if you do, it becomes on marginal issues. Okay, you have a right to property, you have a right maybe to press. I'm not undermining these rights, but you can't reach one comprehensive document without solving the big question. So what you can do, I think, I'm not minimizing. We're still going to be losing something. It's 50%. Maybe I was exaggerating when I said 10. Maybe it's like 2.5 from 5, right? I don't know. It's a relative question, right? I don't have a quantitative number in this respect. We would be losing something, but as the primary stakeholders, what I'm trying to say, listen, what existed was even bad enough. So we're losing something from bad to worse. We're not losing something from the ideal to nothing. So that was my point. Yes, we should be vocal. We should be articulate in terms of exposing what exists, and be probably optimistic that somebody would be hearing us.
I heard the word optimistic, so that's a good point to end this webinar. Thank you so much for your contributions. Thank you, Mikhail. Thanks, Omri, Noga, Amira, Mairav. Thank you all for your excellent remarks and your dealing with the questions. A special thank you to all of our audience, wherever you are today. We invite you to join us again in future webinars. And of course, this webinar will be posted. It's already on social media, and you can view it again if you missed it or missed parts of it, but will be posted again on our website after some minor editing. Thank you all. Appreciate it. Good day, everybody.